Why would a newborn elephant stop trying to live, even after being rescued? Veterinarians were running out of time, hope was fading, and nothing they tried could reach him. Then, in a moment, no one planned for and no one could explain, a dog stepped into the enclosure and changed everything. What happened next challenged everything science thought it knew about trauma, connection, and survival. Stay with us, because what this dog did for a baby elephant will leave you speechless. A life that refused the world. The first sound he ever heard should have been a call to belong. Instead, it arrived as noise without meaning. When the newborn elephant was pulled from the mud, his chest still moving, rescuers expected panic, flailing, instinctive cries. What they saw instead was something far more unsettling. He lay still, eyes open, breathing steadily, making no attempt to rise or respond. Survival reflexes that had guided elephants for millions of years were absent from the very beginning. Within minutes, experienced handlers noticed the problem was not physical weakness. His muscles flexed when touched. His heart rate remained strong. His lungs filled evenly. Yet, when warmth was offered, he turned his head away. When milk brushed his lips, he sealed his mouth shut. This was not an injury. This was a refusal. Veterinarians later described the moment as deeply disorienting. Newborn elephants are neurologically wired for attachment. In the wild, calves vocalize constantly, seeking reassurance from the herd. This calf made no sound. Not a cry, not a rumble, not even the low-frequency vibrations elephants use to signal distress. Silence, in a species defined by communication, became the first clue that something fundamental had broken before anyone arrived. Hours passed, then days. The calf remained alive but unreachable. Attempts to stimulate interest through scent failed. Soft earth, familiar plant matter, even recordings of distant elephant calls produced no reaction. He did not recoil. He did not engage. His stillness was not fear-driven. It was deliberate, almost controlled. Staff members began referring to him not as unresponsive, but as withdrawn. The facility where he was brought had seen trauma before: orphaned calves from poaching incidents, injured juveniles separated from migrating herds. None had ever presented like this. Trauma usually arrives loud and chaotic. This one arrived quiet and sealed. No external wounds could explain it. No neurological scans revealed abnormalities. The body functioned. The will did not. Caretakers started documenting subtle behaviors. The calf avoided eye contact. When repositioned, he complied mechanically but never initiated movement. He slept lightly, waking often, yet never sought proximity to those nearby. Elephants are known to press their trunks against others during rest to maintain reassurance. This calf kept space, even when alone. Behavioral specialists were consulted. They reviewed footage, frame by frame. A hypothesis emerged that challenged conventional rescue logic. The calf may not have been shutting down due to injury or fear. He may have been responding to loss that occurred before rescue. Elephants form maternal bonds within hours of birth. Separation at that stage can fracture attachment pathways before they fully form. This reframed everything. If the calf had bonded and lost in rapid succession, his withdrawal might not be shock, but grief without language. A psychological state so early and profound that it bypassed struggle entirely. Not despair in the human sense. Something colder. Something quieter. As days stretched on, a troubling pattern solidified. The calf's physical health remained stable, yet his engagement with the world continued to diminish. Staff realized they were not fighting illness. They were confronting an absence, the absence of curiosity, the absence of desire, the absence of connection. This was no longer a rescue story. It was a question science had rarely faced head-on. What happens when an animal chooses not to participate in life before it truly begins? And if survival instincts can be overridden this early, what does that mean for everything we thought we understood about resilience? If this was not a medical emergency, but a psychological one unfolding in silence, how could anyone possibly intervene without causing further harm? Come with us as the mystery deepens. The limits of expertise. Once the crisis was redefined as psychological rather than physical, the room changed. Whiteboards replaced stretchers. Clipboards replaced urgency. The calf was no longer treated as a patient in danger of dying, but as a case that defied existing categories. That shift brought confidence at first. Modern wildlife medicine prides itself on adaptability. If one framework fails, another is applied. The first approach was stimulation through routine. Elephants respond to consistency, predictable feeding schedules, controlled lighting, and measured human presence. Caregivers introduced a carefully timed cycle of activity and rest. Every interaction was logged. Every reaction was scored. The calf complied with handling but remained detached. Routine created stability but not engagement. Medical specialists ruled out neurological impairment. Brainstem reflexes were intact. Auditory pathways functioned normally. Pain indicators remained low. Appetite suppression was not linked to digestive dysfunction. Each test narrowed the field further until what remained was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. There was no malfunction left to fix. As days passed, subtle frustration crept into professional discussions. Not outwardly. Experts are trained to remain composed. But notes grew longer. Meetings stretched later. Words like atypical and nonconforming appeared with increasing frequency. These were placeholders for something harder to admit. Expertise was reaching its edge. A behavioral psychologist proposed controlled dependency. The idea was controversial. The calf would be encouraged to associate nourishment with a specific caretaker through proximity feeding and mirrored breathing techniques. This method had shown success in rebuilding trust with traumatized juveniles of other large mammals. The plan was approved cautiously. The result was unexpected. The calf accepted nourishment when physical necessity demanded it, but never sought the caretaker afterward. No recognition was formed. No anticipation developed. The bond refused to take hold. The technique did not fail violently. It simply dissolved. Internal debates grew sharper. Some argued that continued intervention was preventing natural recalibration. Others warned that removing support would accelerate shutdown. The calf's steady breathing and calm demeanor complicated the debate. He did not look like an animal in distress. He looked like an animal opting out. This distinction haunted the staff. Wildlife care is built on the assumption that life always seeks continuation. That assumption guides rescue funding, staffing, and decision-making. Here was a living contradiction. A body functioning perfectly well without expressing any desire to participate in its own survival. One senior veterinarian raised a question few wanted to address aloud. What if the calf's withdrawal was not a symptom to be treated, but a response to be respected? The room went quiet. Respecting it could mean allowing the process to complete. No one said what that process was. Documentation continued. Intake logs became chronicles of stillness. The calf's weight stabilized but did not increase. His gaze remained unfocused. His reactions remained minimal. Each successful medical outcome felt hollow, like repairing a vessel whose destination no longer mattered. By the end of the second week, the sanctuary had exhausted every method grounded in formal training. Manuals offered nothing further. Case studies ended before this point. Experience, usually the final authority, provided no answers. What remained was a stark realization. Science could sustain the body, but it could not manufacture purpose. And without purpose, survival itself became an open question. If expertise had reached its limit and intervention risked doing harm, what happens when time becomes the only force left acting on a life already pulling away? Share with us to explore the hidden corners of the story. Time as the final threat. The moment expertise fell silent, time stepped forward. Not dramatically, not urgently, but with the steady pressure of something that does not argue or explain itself. The sanctuary shifted into a quieter phase, one where no new treatments were introduced and no bold theories proposed. Observation replaced action. Waiting became work. Daily reports began to emphasize duration rather than change. How long the calf stood without moving. How long his gaze rested on nothing in particular. How long he slept without shifting position. These measurements were not symptoms. They were markers of persistence. The calf was not deteriorating, yet he was not advancing toward life either. He was suspended. Sanctuary leadership convened privately. The discussion was no longer about treatment options. It was about thresholds. How long could they justify sustaining a life that showed no internal momentum? Wildlife ethics rarely confront this question directly. Most cases involve clear suffering or clear recovery. This case occupied a narrow, disturbing middle. The calf's calm presentation complicated decision-making. There were no vocalizations of distress, no signs of agitation, no physical collapse. Visitors passing the enclosure would have seen a peaceful animal resting. Only those monitoring closely understood the absence beneath the surface. Peace, in this context, did not equal well-being. Caregivers began rotating assignments more frequently. Emotional fatigue was setting in. Working with an animal that never acknowledged presence created a unique strain. There was no feedback loop, no small victories, no reassurance that effort mattered. Some staff admitted, quietly, that being near the calf felt like being near a closed door. As days extended into weeks, a subtle shift occurred within the team. Language changed. Phrases like, "when he recovers," disappeared. In their place emerged conditional phrasing. "If there is a change." Should engagement return? This linguistic adjustment signaled an internal acceptance that outcomes were no longer predictable. External consultants were briefed. Their responses were cautious and fragmented. Similar cases existed in fragments across species. Dolphins following deceased calves for days. Primates withdrawing after social collapse. Birds ceasing song after habitat destruction. None offered a clear roadmap. Most ended ambiguously. One consultant introduced a concept rarely applied in veterinary contexts: learned futility. Unlike learned helplessness, which arises from repeated failure, learned futility can emerge from singular, overwhelming loss. The organism does not struggle because struggle no longer aligns with any expected outcome. The cost outweighs the possibility. If this applied, time was not neutral. Each passing day could reinforce the calf's internal conclusion. Survival without meaning becomes maintenance, not living. The sanctuary faced a paradox. Sustaining him might be teaching him that nothing new would happen. Yet, withdrawing support posed its own moral hazard. Allowing decline could be interpreted as surrender. Public accountability loomed quietly in the background. Rescue institutions exist under scrutiny. Every decision carries symbolic weight beyond the individual animal. The calf himself remained unchanged. He accepted care without resistance. He rejected initiative without hostility. His presence forced everyone around him into reflection, not about him alone, but about the assumptions underlying rescue itself. Is survival an absolute good, or does it depend on internal consent? Can an animal refuse life without suffering? And, if so, does intervention become imposition? By the end of the third week, the sanctuary reached a point where doing nothing felt as consequential as doing something. Time, once a passive element, had become the primary force shaping the outcome. Every sunrise narrowed the range of ethical choices available. No alarms sounded. No dramatic downturn announced itself. The danger lay in quiet continuation, in the possibility that waiting itself was the final decision. As the team stood at this narrowing crossroads, an unexpected development elsewhere would soon complicate everything they thought they understood about isolation, loss, and survival. Stay with us as the next twist unfolds. A grief that walks on four legs. Hundreds of miles away, in a facility built for an entirely different purpose, another survivor lived within a silence no one had yet connected to the calves. This place was not a sanctuary in the traditional sense. It was a transitional holding center, designed to stabilize animals displaced by sudden violence before determining their future. Temporary by design, emotionally unfinished. The animal had arrived months earlier under escort, not rescue. Her intake file was thin, deliberately so. Much of what preceded her arrival was undocumented, either lost in chaos or never recorded to begin with. What remained were fragments, a destroyed habitat, a single surviving individual, no accompanying group. She was fully grown, physically imposing, and behaviorally subdued. Her body carried no visible injuries. Her posture, however, told a different story. She moved slowly, not from weakness but from deliberation. Every step appeared calculated. Every pause is intentional. This animal had once belonged to a tightly bonded social unit. Her species depends on constant contact, grooming, vocal exchange, physical proximity. Loss within such groups is not abstract. It is experienced collectively. When that structure collapses, survivors often display behaviors that defy simple categorization. In her case, the defining feature was loyalty without an object. She slept near the same corner every night. She avoided the center of the enclosure. When feeding times arrived, she waited until all activity ceased before approaching. It was as if she were maintaining space for others who were no longer there. Caretakers initially misread her restraint as compliance. Only later did patterns emerge. She positioned herself facing outward during rest, a posture typically associated with group vigilance. She vocalized only at night, producing low sounds rarely captured during daytime observation. These sounds were not calls for response. They were acknowledgments of absence. The facility had seen grief before. Animals mourn in varied ways. Some become agitated. Some refuse food. Some vocalize relentlessly. This was different. Her grief had settled into her routine. It shaped her movements. It dictated her distance. Behavioral assessment suggested she was not depressed in the clinical sense. Stress hormones were elevated but stable. Appetite remained consistent. What was absent was curiosity. No investigation, no play, no deviation. Survival continued, stripped of variation. One caretaker described her as holding position. The phrase lingered. Holding position implies expectation. It implies waiting for a condition to change, yet nothing around her did. Unlike the calf, this animal had memory. Her withdrawal was not the result of an early fracture, but of accumulated loss. She knew what the connection was. She also knew it was gone. That knowledge shaped every choice she made. Weeks passed with minimal change. The facility debated relocation options. Solitary housing was not ideal long-term. Social reintroduction carried risks. She showed no interest in potential companions. No hostility either. Indifference can be more difficult to address than aggression. What troubled the staff most was her predictability. Trauma often destabilizes behavior. In her case, it had stabilized it too well. Every day mirrored the last. It was a closed loop of endurance. At no point did anyone suggest linking her case to the elephant calf. The two situations existed in separate administrative worlds. Different species, different histories, different locations. Any resemblance was coincidental. For now, yet both force the same uncomfortable question into professional spaces. What does recovery mean when survival continues without engagement? When the body adapts, but the inner orientation does not? As reports circulated quietly among specialists, a few began to notice the pattern emerging across cases. Not a syndrome, not a diagnosis. Something looser, a shared shape. If grief could reorganize behavior so completely in one animal, and withdrawal could preempt life itself in another, what might happen if those two trajectories ever intersected? And what would it mean to introduce connection not as treatment, but as an experiment no one could fully predict? Stay with us as the secrets grow even darker. The idea no one was trained to have. The idea did not arrive during a formal meeting. It surfaced in fragments, between shifts, spoken carefully and then abandoned mid-sentence. No one wanted to claim it outright. In institutions built on protocol, truly new ideas often appear first as discomfort. It began when a junior behavioral ecologist reviewed case summaries from multiple facilities while preparing an unrelated report. She noticed a pattern not in symptoms, but in absences. Engagement absent. Curiosity is absent. Social orientation absent. Different species, different histories. The common thread was not trauma itself, but what followed it. A narrowing of the animal's internal world. She brought the observation to a supervisor, framing it cautiously. Not as a solution, but as a question. What if recovery could not be triggered internally at all? What if it required an external presence that carried its own unresolved state? This was not a concept supported by training manuals. Rehabilitation focuses on restoring normal function, not introducing complexity. The goal is stabilization, predictability, and safety. The suggestion being floated challenged all three. The proposal was simple in structure and radical in implication. What if two animals, each stalled in isolation for different reasons, were allowed to exist in proximity without expectation? Not to bond, not to interact, simply to share space under controlled conditions. Immediately, objections surfaced. Cross-species proximity carries risks, stress transfer, behavioral confusion, institutional liability. There was no established metric for success, no precedent that could be cited confidently. More troubling was the philosophical challenge. Rehabilitation assumes the caretaker as the active agent. This idea removed humans from the center of the process. It suggested that animals might offer something to each other that no amount of professional expertise could replicate. The concept lingered because it addressed a growing unease. Both cases had reached a plateau where further intervention risked stagnation. Doing nothing was not neutral anymore. It was shaping outcomes by default. Senior staff demanded justification grounded in observable behavior, not intuition. The ecologist returned with data. Studies showing reduced stress indicators in animals exposed to non-threatening, unfamiliar species. Evidence that presence alone can alter neural pathways associated with vigilance and withdrawal. Not interaction. Presence. The room remained divided. Some saw potential, others saw recklessness. The reputational risk was undeniable. If the experiment failed, it would not be seen as a miscalculation, but as negligence. Yet, beneath the resistance lay a deeper fear. Accepting the idea meant acknowledging that existing frameworks had reached their limit, that healing might require something unstructured, something unmeasurable. Discussions grew quieter. Fewer people attended voluntarily. Decisions stalled. Meanwhile, both animals remained unchanged in their respective spaces, continuing their parallel trajectories without convergence. What ultimately shifted the balance was not data, but timing. External pressures mounted. Funding cycles approached review. Long-term stagnation would require explanation. Innovation, even risky innovation, could be framed as active effort. A narrow proposal was drafted. No forced contact. No shared enclosure. Distance maintained. Monitoring continues. The animals would be aware of each other without obligation. Even then, approval came with hesitation. This was not a solution. It was an attempt to interrupt a closed loop, a way to introduce novelty without demand. Logistics followed. Transport considerations, quarantine protocols, sensory exposure limits. Everything was designed to minimize intrusion while allowing presence to register. What no one could predict was how the animals themselves would interpret the situation. There was no guarantee of comfort, no assurance of benefit, only the possibility that something unresolved in one might resonate with something unresolved in the other. As preparations moved forward, a quiet tension settled over the teams involved. This was no longer about saving face or proven expertise. It was about relinquishing control. And if presence alone had the power to alter an internal trajectory, what might happen when two lives shaped by absence finally became aware of each other? Let us guide you into what no one expected. Communication without sight. The first rule was distance. Not symbolic distance, but measured, deliberate separation. The animals would not see each other. Visual contact introduces expectation, dominance cues, and instinctive categorization. Sight demands response. This experiment required none. Instead, the environment was adjusted subtly. Barriers were repositioned, airflow patterns altered, sound traveled differently. The change was not announced. There was no moment of introduction. Presence was allowed to emerge gradually without instruction. The calf was the first to register something new, not consciously, not behaviorally. It appeared first in his posture. His breathing rhythm shifted slightly, no longer perfectly uniform. The change was minor enough to be dismissed by anyone not tracking him hour by hour. But it was there. Elephants perceive the world through vibration as much as sound. Low-frequency signals travel through ground and air, registering in the body before the mind assigns meaning. What entered the calf's awareness was not another animal, but irregularity, a pattern that did not belong to the facility itself. He did not lift his head. He did not move toward the source, but his stillness softened. Muscular tension that had become habitual loosened incrementally. Conservation gave way to alert rest. Across the barrier, the other animal responded differently. Her reaction came at night. Movement patterns shifted. She no longer positioned herself exclusively toward the perimeter. During rest, her body angled slightly inward toward the shared boundary. The shift was small, but it broke weeks of rigid routine. No one intervened. That was the second rule. Observation only. The temptation to accelerate connection was strong. Every instinct trained into caretakers urged engagement. It was resisted. Sound became the primary medium. Not vocalizations directed outward, but ambient presence. Footfalls, breathing, subtle movement. These were not signals in the traditional sense, they were confirmations. Something else existed nearby, persisting through time. The calf's feeding behavior changed next, not in volume or frequency, but in pacing. He paused between intake, listened, not with ears, but with stillness. His attention, previously collapsed inward, extended slightly beyond himself. The other animal began producing low-frequency sounds more consistently. Not calls, not attempts at contact. Rhythmic emissions without expectation of reply. In social species, such sounds often function as reassurance rather than communication. They say, "I am here," without asking anything in return. Physiological markers followed behavioral ones. Stress indicators stabilized further. Sleep cycles deepened. Neither animal approached the barrier. Neither attempted to retreat. The space between them became occupied, not by action, but by awareness. What astonished the monitoring team was the absence of escalation. No agitation, no territorial signaling, no fear response. The animals were not interpreting each other as threats or opportunities. They were registering coexistence. This contradicted long-held assumptions about recovery. Trauma responses are often addressed through gradual exposure paired with reassurance. Here, exposure existed without reassurance. And yet, something was shifting. On the fifth night, the calf made his first voluntary sound. It was brief and unstructured. Not a call, not a signal, more an exhalation shaped by vibration. It did not repeat. The sound was not answered directly. But within minutes, movement occurred on the other side of the barrier. Slow, deliberate, not approach, not retreat. Acknowledgement without engagement. From that point on, change accelerated subtly. The calf began orienting his body differently during rest. Not toward caretakers, not toward walls, toward the shared space. His internal map was updating. No one labeled this progress aloud. Naming it would imply ownership. This phase belonged to the animals. What was unfolding could not be charted as treatment or therapy. It was a negotiation. Two beings, each shaped by absence, learning that presence could exist without cost. If connection does not begin with touch or sight or instruction, but with tolerated proximity, how many assumptions about healing have we been getting wrong? Stay close as the layers continue to peel back. A new map for survival. The change did not announce itself as recovery. There were no sudden movements, no dramatic reversals, no visible relief among the observers. What emerged instead was orientation, a subtle but decisive shift in how each animal positioned itself within the world. The calf began to initiate movement without prompting, not toward food, not toward caretakers, toward space itself. He explored the boundaries of his enclosure with slow intent, pausing often, not from hesitation, but from assessment. The environment was no longer something he endured. It had become something he referenced. His body language reflected this recalibration. Weight distribution changed. Resting positions became asymmetrical, signaling readiness rather than conservation. These were not learned behaviors, they were rediscovered ones, returning without instruction. Across the barrier, the other animal adjusted her routines in ways that defied previous patterns. She varied her pacing. She occupied different resting locations. The rigid predictability that had defined her days dissolved into choice. Not randomness, choice. Caretakers noticed something else. Neither animal sought reassurance from humans as these changes unfolded. The shift was internally driven, but not internally sourced. It had emerged through shared presence, then taken on its own momentum. This forced a reconsideration of what recovery actually meant. Traditional rehabilitation models emphasize dependency reduction through structured milestones. Here, dependency had never formed. What had developed instead was alignment. Each animal recalibrated independently while remaining aware of the other's existence. The calf's vocal behavior evolved next. Sounds became more frequent, though still sparse. They were not directed outward. They occurred during moments of transition, standing to resting, feeding to stillness. These vocalizations appeared to function as internal markers, anchoring him in his own actions. The other animal responded not with imitation, but with temporal consistency. Her rhythms stabilized around him without synchronizing fully. This lack of mirroring was important. It indicated coexistence rather than bonding. At no point did staff attempt to name what was happening. Labels would imply a destination. What they were witnessing was not progress toward normalcy, but the construction of a new baseline. Medical metrics followed behavioral ones, but did not lead them. Energy expenditure increased slightly. Sleep cycles shortened without degradation. Appetite diversified. None of this suggested dependency or regression. It suggested engagement. The sanctuary adjusted its long-term planning accordingly. The goal was no longer reintegration or replication of wild conditions. It was sustainability, a life that could continue without forcing a narrative of restoration. This reframing extended beyond the two animals. Policy discussions shifted. Case reviews incorporated new language. Terms like participation and agency appeared alongside traditional welfare metrics. Survival was no longer treated as a binary outcome. The most significant outcome was philosophical. The staff began to understand that healing does not always move toward what existed before. Sometimes it moves sideways. Sometimes it invents something entirely new. Neither animal became what they had been. The calf did not return to an imagined version of early social engagement. The other animal did not resume the structure of her lost group. What emerged instead was adaptability rooted in awareness rather than attachment. The experiment concluded quietly. Barriers remained. Distance was preserved. The outcome was not a merging of lives, but a reawakening of direction. Ultimately, no one claimed success. There was no template to replicate, only a realization that survival can take forms we are not trained to recognize. Did the bond between a baby elephant and an unexpected companion surprise you? And did it change how you think about healing and survival? Which moment moved you the most? And do you believe animals understand loss better than we realize? Share with us what stayed with you long after the story ended.